I'm thinking about the power of literature to help us understand consequences. So I'm going to give you two examples which come to mind in this conversation. One is the book that EconTalk listeners know I've talked about in great depth, which is In the First Circle by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's a story of what happened to intellectuals, scientists, mathematicians, and engineers who were put to work in the name of improving the tyrannical and authoritarian powers of Stalin. And if I said to you, Stalin it was really hard to live in the Soviet Union under Stalin, you'd say, yeah, he was a dictator. But until you've read a book like that, or a book like Forever Flowing by Vasily Grossman, you don't really, unless you've had friends who live there who've told you about it, just to say, yeah, it was horrible, or people were afraid, or, it was kind of corrupt because rewards weren't handed out in a decentralized way. I think until you've actually heard at least a story about it, of that level of quality of literature, you can't really get any idea of how horrifying it really was. And similarly, and maybe I'm being unfair here, and maybe this is a stretch, but to me, when you talk about socialism or capitalism, and you say, yeah, this is how it works, and we give it a tweet version of how it works, I think we're missing so much of the richness of it that, the example you just gave about hoarding, just a small example of how an enterprise in the Soviet Union would hoard material. And we understand how often it would sometimes make bad allocation decisions because they were rewarded, say, on the weight of their output rather than, say, profitability. We all know that. We put that in the back of our mind. But I think the day-to-day texture of how decisions were made teaches you something you can't really appreciate without that fuller picture. And I think that's incredibly important.
It's actually interesting, Russ, that you mentioned the power of literature. I was recently in a conversation that was also like this one, online conversation with Daniel Shavira from NYU, who is one of the famous tax specialists, but in his free time interest is he reads a lot, reads literature, and actually he had a book called Literature and Inequality, and it's a story of nine books, starts with Jane Austen and ends with American literature with Mark Twain and Theodore Dreiser, showing how social inequality and how relations between classes and individuals and so on were really captured in these big novels, mostly European and American novels of the 19th and the early 20th century. And it's actually quite extraordinary. I love the book. I read 4 out of 9 books that he has there. He has Stendhal, for example, and so on. And I use the same thing in my The Haves and the Have-Nots, where I use the Jane Austen, The Pride and Prejudice, and also Anna Karenina to actually situate. For example, Mr. Darcy is like in a top one, we don't even know exactly, but the top 1/10 or even less of top 1% in terms of income and wealth. And of course, Elizabeth Bennet is the top 1%. So what we see in the book, we see really a sliver of the English income distribution, and we see a big gap between them, which of course is true. There is a big gap between me and Bill Gates, but we are all in the top of the U.S. income distribution, so that's what we see. And of course, we see in Jane Austen that if Elizabeth doesn't marry, as you know, that actually then the entails kick in, and actually she would go back to something which would be the median wage at that time, which was like 1/20th, 1/40th, I don't remember, of what she had with the family. So she would really lose a lot by not marrying Mr. Darcy. With Anna Karenina, the story is somewhat similar.